But anyway, my name's Norman Caulfield, for those of you who don't know me. I've been teaching here at Fort Hays State for quite a long time, 28 years to be exact. And I teach Latin American history here. I teach Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and I'm doing Cuba today. And this topic I selected because not too many people really know much about this. It's an interesting topic. So I'm going to start by just saying a few things about the word normalization. And, you know, I would say that beginning, I will just suggest that many things that are done in terms of policy do not have the intended consequences. And of course, we will get into the embargo that the United States established with Cuba, or against Cuba, we should say, way back in the early 1960s. And the intention was to isolate Cuba and ultimately make the regime crack, break up, and blow away, and install a government similar to what they had before Fidel Castro. Of course, that didn't happen. If anything, the consequences were that Cuba was not isolated. Cuba ended up having many friends, and therefore the policy was a failure. I'm going to point that out. But you know, there's lots of things like this in policy. You ever notice, like, okay, the war on poverty, well, it's produced more poverty. The war on drugs has produced more drugs. The war on terror has produced more terror. Okay? So this is just one in a long line of things that you can think of, and I like to always think of the Federal Reserve and printing money. The money printing the Federal Reserve does is designed to generate inflation. Yet they tell us there's deflation, and they print all this money. And of course, what does deflation and inflation mean? Well, deflation and inflation mean different things to different people. You know, deflation might be what you're experiencing because you'll find that your money doesn't purchase what it used to purchase. Inflation might be somebody who's invested a lot of money in assets, and their assets have went up, and in turn prices for you have went up. Okay, so how do we define terms sometimes? Very difficult. You know, the definitions of inflation and deflation have changed, and I'm going to show that the definition of normalization, at least in this context, is very tenuous. And not that it's necessarily changed, but it's tenuous. So let's get started. Normalization defined. Well, I already said that the embargo was designed to destabilize Cuba. It was designed to change the regime, and all these strategies failed. Now why? Well, let's look at globalization. And you know, we can talk about globalization in many different ways, but I look at it as, okay, you offshore production, the globalization of production, of manufacturing, and since the 1970s we can see evidence of this happening. And the result has been the competitive pressures building up in the global economy. In line with this, we see the rise of China. And China has, of course, profoundly altered international economic and strategic relations. And of course, the collapse of the USSR. Cuba was allied with the USSR. And not only the USSR, the model of third world nationalism collapsed about the same time. In other words, those two things went hand in glove. And I can think of a lot of leaders who, for example, Nasser in Egypt, he played both ends against the middle. You know, he worked with the Soviets and he worked with the Americans. Tito in Yugoslavia did the same thing. But after the collapse of the USSR, this model of nationalism in the third world sort of disintegrates. So what I want to do now is look at the U.S. and Cuba and the long history of relations between those two countries. In the early American Republic, leaders of the United States viewed Cuba as a place that would eventually become part of the United States because of its geographical proximity. And that was an intention early on. It doesn't turn out that way, as we'll see later. But Spain, of course, which had Cuba as a colony and kept it as a colony after the other colonies in Latin America gained their independence in the early 1820s. Cuba didn't go in that direction because what had happened in Haiti with the slave rebellion, and many of those planters moved from Haiti to Cuba, and they weren't about to talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity because they had seen planters get their heads cut off in Haiti. So hush hush about independence, we don't want any part of that. But when we get into the mid-19th century, there are a number of filibustering. This is mercenary stuff. The biggest player in this is a guy named Narcisco Lopez. And a lot of this was generated by Southern slaveholding interests who had designs on Cuba to take it over, divide it up into 3 states, and of course that would enhance the representation of these states in the U.S. Congress. But along comes the Mexican War, and what happens is a lot of people that lived in what used to be Mexico would lose their land. So the Cuban planter class finally said, well, we don't want to run the risk of losing our land to the Americans, so let's just forget about annexing ourselves to the United States, for the moment anyway. And in the process, the United States gradually becomes the biggest market for Cuban sugar. Then, after slavery is ended in the United States, as a result of the Civil War, there is a war for independence finally in Cuba. And it's called the 10 Years' War, and it goes on from 1868 to 1878. Now the consequences of the 10 Years' War are that the war destroys the Cuban economy, and American investors will come in and gobble up a lot of the land in Cuba, and they will begin to dominate the Cuban economy at this point. Late 1870s, early 1880s, the Americans are beginning to dominate the economy. So not only does the United States represent Cuba's biggest market for sugar, the United States, and, well, let's say not the government, but many people from the United States, William Randolph Hearst being one of them, will end up owning millions of acres of land in Cuba, okay, as a result of this. And this is an important point. I'm going to talk more about this later. But from this point onward, the Americans will dominate the Cuban economy in both export and the domestic production. Now, I've introduced the term neo-colonialism, right? If you know anything about the history of the United States, when the United States came of age in the late 19th century and basically said, okay, we're going to be an expansionist power, but we're not going to be like the Europeans were. We're not going to colonize peoples directly. What we'd like to do is set up markets, create outlets for capital investment, and maybe use cheap labor where it's available. This arrangement that I just described is generally referred to as neo-colonialism because you don't have direct colonial control, say like the British did in India or the French did in Vietnam. Okay. So if you look at Cuban history, and that goes all the way up to today, the history is shaped principally by the abortive character of its independence struggle, which effectively transfers its status from a colonial possession of moribund Spanish colonialism. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is the Spanish, if the Americans are coming in and dominating the Cuban economy and the biggest market for sugar is in the United States, then what do the Spanish have to do with this anymore? The only thing they're doing is taxing the Cubans. So the Cubans are saying, okay, let's get rid of the Spanish because they're nothing but parasites at this point in time. So anyway, they moved from Spanish colonialism to an economic and political semi-colony of the rising imperialist power of the United States. Now we have the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Spanish-American War, or what should be called the Spanish-American-Cuban War. The U.S. intervenes in Cuba in 1898 following a 30-year war. I just went over that. The intervention was short and decisive. The Spanish, of course, were relieved of their colonies, a settlement in which the Cubans themselves had no participation.
Dr. Caulfield,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, there is food now, so if you would
Well,
like...
that's okay to interrupt me for food. You people go get your food and start eating.
If you'd like to...
I can't eat and talk at the same time, so I'm out of it. Just save me a slice of pizza for the end.
If you'd like to come and get your pizza or salad or drink, there is stuff up there.
Good deal. Now we're talking about the Platt Amendment. This is the most interesting thing. Many historians have called this period the Platt Amendment Republic. Senator Orville Platt from Connecticut, he basically thought of this amendment to insert into the Cuban Constitution. It included a prohibition against the nominally independent Cuban Republic entering into any international treaty deemed prejudicial to U.S. interests. What this essentially meant, the United States would determine who the Cubans could do business with. So they had complete control. So it wasn't a colony. In fact, what had happened with the declaration of war against Spain, Senator Teller from Colorado inserted an amendment and said, we will not annex Cuba. And a lot of that had to do with race relations in the United States during the 1890s. 1890s, of course, had the landmark Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the separate but equal doctrine. And of course, there were more lynchings of blacks in the decade of the 1890s than any other decade in the history of the United States. So race relations in the 1890s in the U.S. were at a low ebb, and since Cuba had a large black population, Senator Teller from Colorado insisted that this amendment be attached to the declaration of war against Spain. Therefore, we did not annex Cuba. But we figured out how to control it. We introduced the Platt Amendment, and this became part of the Cuban Constitution.
What state was Platt from?
1902.
No, what state? Senator from what state?
Oh, he was from Connecticut. I thought I said that earlier. Of course, not only could they tell Cuba who to do business with and who to not do business with, the United States reserved the right to intervene militarily. And this is a right from the Cuban Constitution for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, and for discharging the obligations with respect to Cuba imposed, imposed by the Treaty of Paris. The U.S. would avail itself of this right repeatedly in the first part of the 20th century, really all the way up to 1934. Well, you know, the dependence that Cuba has on the United States is not merely the formal one embodied in the Platt Amendment. It really rests upon the export of sugar to the U.S. market. The single crop accounted for the vast majority of the island's export earnings, and as I said repeatedly here already, it was shipped almost exclusively to the United States. So what develops in Cuba as a result of this dependency is what is called a monoculture. And a monoculture is when you grow one crop in a country and you're completely dependent on your survival from the growing of that crop, whether it be rice, whether it be tobacco, and in this case, whatever it's sugar. So what this does is condemn the majority of the population to backwardness. So we have lots of poverty and we have chronic unemployment. Now, these political and social relations that developed as a result of this were bound up really with the uncompleted struggle for national independence. Now, I need to point out too that this semi-colonial status that Cuba suffered under was certainly among the more blatant in the world, but it was by no means unique. This occurred in other places around the world. Now, I was thinking about, Deep Throat and Watergate and all the President's Men movie, Follow the Money. The relationship between the U.S. and Cuba gave rise to a political setup which is notable for its impotence, extreme corruption, and frequent eruptions of violence. Let me explain what that means. Because the Americans dominated the whole economy, and it's explained here in the next paragraph, there wasn't any real avenue for enrichment for Cubans. And so what they did, they had to organize themselves politically into parties, and those parties would vie for control of the Cuban government. That was the only way they could enrich themselves, because the Americans controlled the money-making aspects of the economy, lock, stock, and barrel. Okay. Of course, what this does, and by the way, a lot of foreign immigrants come in, and they start, other than Americans, we're talking about Spaniards and others, they'll come in and with money and they'll buy up things. So you have this business and landowning class that will breed Cuban nationalism. And this will be characterized by an extreme anti-Americanism and even what we could call a xenophobic strain. Well, let's talk about Cuba between the revolutions. In 1925, the Cuban Communist Party was founded. That's an important event because Castro eventually comes to power and he calls himself a communist, although the Communist Party would oppose Castro coming to power. And I don't want to talk about the history of the Communist Party in Cuba, but this was a response to what we had seen in the previous slides. Then the United States, in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt takes the office of presidency and gives his inaugural speech in March of that year, he announces the policy of the good neighbor. And what this means is that we're not going to intervene anymore. And Cuba is one of these countries where the U.S. intervened constantly, mostly to settle accounts between these political parties and the factions that were warring. And eventually they figured it out. We'll just tell these people they got to take turns rotating in and out of power. Okay? And that's what the U.S. did in Puerto Rico, and they did the same thing in the Philippines. And they took that over. But here's what happens. That's a policy of non-intervention. But almost immediately, there's a revolution in Cuba in 1933. Much of this has to do with the decline of the price of sugar. It goes down to about 1/2 penny a pound. There's widespread unemployment. And so we have a revolution. And the United States has a problem on its hands. What do? We've declared the good neighbor policy of non-intervention, but hey, we just can't let this get out of control. We've got lots of investments in Cuba. There's a lot of powerful people that we need to protect. And so the good neighbor policy is transformed in Cuba first because a sergeant in the Cuban army who carries out this revolt and overthrows the dictator named Machado, his name is Fulgencio Batista. And Sumner Wells, an American diplomat, will come into Cuba and he'll make a deal with Batista. And the deal goes like this. Batista will be the beneficiary of a constabulary force trained by the U.S. Marines. And instead of the United States intervening constantly to protect American interests, we now have, as we'll say, our man in Havana, Fulgencio Batista, who runs this army, and I almost call it a private army because that's really what it functioned like. And so we have not democracy, but dictatorship. I might just add that good neighbor policy was sounding like they wanted democracy, but that was quickly junked because that wasn't practical. What was practical was getting people like Batista in Cuba and then Samoa, Nicaragua, and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Now, Fidel Castro, I'm not going to get into a detailed biography of him, but let me just say a few things. First of all, he comes from a well-to-do family. He goes to a Jesuit high school, university. He's actually taught by many priests who were associated with the Spanish Phalange. That means Franco's fascist. And so Castro comes out of that, and he joins, when he's at the University of Havana going to law school, he joins the Orthodox Party, which is one of these parties, as well as the Authentic Party, as it was called, that would vie for control over the government. And in Cuba, you started doing this when you were young and you were in college. The student directorate was always this important organization that the political parties vied for control over at the universities. If you're going to study law, you're going to get in government, right? So a lot of this turned violent, this intense competition. And this is the background that Castro is from. Now, you read a lot of things about Castro and say, well, he actually killed somebody. Nobody knows if that's really true, but let me just say this, there were people being killed all the time on the university campus there in downtown Havana due to this whole idea of Americans owning everything, and the only spoils available were to the victors of these rigged elections, basically. And you know, the most important position in Cuban government was getting control of the Cuban lottery, because everybody played the lottery, and you know, you could be corrupt with the lottery, and everybody was. That was the biggest prize. But that was the only thing they had, because the Americans ran everything else. Let's look at the Castro regime when they come to power. You got to put this in perspective. This is one of the more radical variants of the nationalist regimes that came to power in a number of the former colonial countries during the post-World War II era. In all of those revolutions, there was property, foreign-owned properties nationalized, and there were social reforms carried out, Cuba being no exception. So it's not the exception, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, it's more or less the rule if you place in the context of the decolonialization movements that were occurring around the world. And this went all the way up through Vietnam in the 1970s. Well, despite the nationalizations and the social reforms, Cuba was unable to resolve, or excuse me, Castro and his government was unable to resolve Cuba's historic problems of backwardness and dependence that were the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. So the government in Havana had to rely heavily on Soviet subsidies, and these dried up with the USSR's dissolution in the early 90s. Now I got Navidad in Havana. When the Soviet Union fell in Miami, in the exile community, they would put bumper stickers on their car, and it would say Navidad in Havana, question mark, because they felt that it was just only a matter of time, a short period of time, where the Castro government would collapse. Well, that didn't happen, and here's why it didn't happen. The Cuban regime subsequently kept itself afloat through cheap oil supplies in Venezuela, capital investment from Europe, China, Russia, Canada, and Brazil. One of the other things they did was really kick up the tourist industry. Tourism is a huge business, and also the pharmaceutical business, Cuban doctors, Cuban drugs. They're famous around the world. Many people come to Cuba and get operations, and they get them done cheaply, a lot more cheaply than they can elsewhere in the world, because they've got good doctors there that put emphasis on that. But now all this has come full circle, and so we get to the point here, the U.S. and Cuba. What is the Castro regime, because now it's his brother, Raul Castro instead of Fidel? It's seeking its salvation through the return of the Americans. Well, the Obama administration clearly hoped that the rapprochement with Cuba would improve U.S. relations with all the countries of the hemisphere. Because one of the things that I'm going to point out here is that the embargo and the attempted isolation of Cuba really backfired, and in the end, the United States was a country that was actually isolated in Latin America. And that was over the issue of the embargo on Cuba. So the other thing is the United States faces ever-increasing competition from its Asian and European rivals. The U.S. remains Latin America's biggest trading partner only by dint of its free trade pact with Mexico. In Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Venezuela, the United States has been outstripped by China. Let's talk about the rise of China, because this is an important element in all of this. The U.S. has long described the region contemptuously as its backyard. In fact, John Kerry did this just a few years ago. He made the statement, well, this is our backyard, and he became the victim, I should say, of a lot of criticism from Latin Americans. Saying, oh, here we go again. We thought that Obama and Kerry were going to bring change, but we guess not. But anyway, the point here is that the U.S. faces increasing challenges for hegemony from all of its rivals, particularly China. Chinese banks increased their investments in Latin America by 71% last year, lending more than the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank combined. The head of the U.S. military's Southcom, Southern Command, remarked wordily in recent testimony to the U.S. Congress that while the Pentagon is launching its pivot to Asia, China is engaged in its own pivot to the Americas. So in terms of the broader interests of the United States, the rapprochement with Cuba is largely driven by the desire to put an end to a policy that has served as an irritant in the relations between Washington and other nations in the hemisphere. Multipolar world versus unipolar world. Now we're talking about a multipolar Latin America. So if you look at American capitalism, we see a relative decline in American capitalism. That's reflected probably the most in Latin America, as we've just seen, particularly as a result of the inroads of China, but other countries as well, Russia, and the Europeans. So anyway, here we have the Organization of American States. This used to be an American-controlled organization, lock, stock, and barrel. It no longer is. That's another reflection of the decline of the United States and Latin America. After the last summit of the Americas, more than 3 years ago in Cartagena, Colombia, various countries, excuse me, including Colombia, which is Washington's closest ally in the Western Hemisphere, warned that if Cuba did not attend the next session, neither would they. So the United States, at one point in time, used to use the Organization of American States to make ultimatums to Latin American countries. Now we see an example where the Latin American countries are giving the United States an ultimatum. Either you fix this situation with Cuba, or guess what? The Summit of the Americas is dead, and your role in the Organization of American States is also dead. So this was huge. And you know, part of this comes from the fact that Latin America still remains the world's most unequal region. You got approximately 167 million people that now live in poverty, while 200 million more are on the brink of poverty. And side by side, we see the region's richest 1% accumulating lots of wealth. The number of Latin American billionaires has risen to 114, with a combined wealth of $440 billion, an amount that exceeds the gross domestic product of all but Latin America's four largest national economies. So, this is the context in which we're now here we go, the multipolar world. Larger U.S. geostrategic objectives also figured into this. Washington's policy on Cuba has served to isolate the U.S. I've already pointed this out, with opposition to the blockade nearly universal in both Latin America, but also internationally. Moreover, the U.S. has an interest in disrupting close economic and political ties established between Havana and Russia and China, both key targets of growing U.S. military threats. New normal, for its part, and this is where we get into this definition of normalization. What does it mean? Well, it means different things to different people. Castro regime sees a turn toward its longtime nemesis as a means of salvaging its rule and pursuing a path similar to that of China, preserving the privileges of the ruling strata through the development of capitalism and at the expense of the Cuban working class. What underpins this is cheap labor. Underlying this shift are definite material interests, which is determined to hold on to privileges and power, hoping to preserve the state as an interlocutor and cheap labor contractor for foreign capital. It's exactly what China has done. So, you know, the Castro regime looks at that example and they go, why can't we replicate that? Well, the U.S. has other things in mind, as we'll see. Let's look at this embargo. This is codified by law. It remains in effect. Obama is presently using executive authority to ease its enforcement. Restrictions on travel, you can read all that. I'm not going to repeat it. Other U.S. citizens also permitted to provide such financing. Banking ties are being expanded. U.S. travelers allowed for the first time to use credit cards issued by American banks. These are things that they can do without going to Congress. New normal continues. They'll be allowed to export telecommunications equipment, including infrastructure, to provide telephone and internet services. This is already going on. Companies will also be allowed to export building materials, agricultural equipment, machinery, to empower the nascent Cuban private sector and foster greater economic independence from the state. Well, this is more than a half a century, and of course, we have to understand that this not only was an embargo, it was accompanied, as I pointed out early, by efforts on behalf of the CIA and the Pentagon to destabilize the regime and overthrow the Castro government and possibly assassinate its leaders. I forget how many attempts Castro supposedly had on his life. He foiled all of them, but it went on for quite some time. It's all documented. All that stuff's been declassified. We're not making up conspiracy theories here. Now, let's just say this, and I like to point out Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi was somebody who made accommodations with the United States after 9/11. He joined the U.S. war on terror, got rid of his nuclear weapons, if he had any, or his program, but that wasn't good enough for the United States. As we know, the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, in her famous little interview video talking about Gaddafi, we came, we saw, he died, followed by lots of laughter. Okay. So, Washington is still angry over the measures taken by the Cuban Revolution against American profit interests. This hasn't abated. The United States is merely adopting a new tactic or reversing them. That's all that's going on here. Of course, Obama heads the 11th U.S. administration since 1959, and Fidel and his brother Raul have survived. And Obama says, I do not believe we can keep doing the same thing for over 5 decades and expect a different result. I'd like to reference Einstein's, one of his definitions of insanity, keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So I think Obama kind of paraphrased that. He stresses that Washington would continue to pursue issues related to democracy and human rights. And of course, what he really wants to do is impose a U.S. puppet regime. And he wants to restore the kind of relations enjoyed 55 years ago under Batista. And the United States, I could put up lots of quotes on this, the United States makes no bones about this. You know, Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, if you go online and you look at his speech that he made in front of the opening of the American Embassy back in August or September, whatever it was, he openly says that this is what we want. We want an American-style democracy in Cuba. Of course, you can read into that all you want, but they haven't given up on this idea. Then on the other side, the Cubans, they want to stay in power. That is, Raul Castro and his regime. They want a kind of arrangement like China has, but the U.S. doesn't want that. Of course, you know, it's a lot of business prospects, reopening Cuba for American business. Wall Street Journal wrote U.S. companies, a lot of agribusiness. And the Cubans know this because right now they're negotiating, and they say, we don't need your agribusiness. You know, the agricultural sector has been the keenest in trying to lift the embargo for years. And they can't wait to get in there and sell all kinds of stuff. And the Cubans know that, and so they're using that in their negotiations with the United States, saying, well, we really don't care about the agribusiness in the United States. They're using that as a bargaining chip. Well, what about this embargo? How are you going to do it? How are you going to lift it? Now, you have big business pressing strongly for a lifting of the embargo, but there are elements within the U.S. government who don't want this. So that's another issue. The big thing is, you know, if the United States doesn't lift the embargo, the argument goes that U.S. rivals in Europe and Asia will increase their own investments, and the U.S. will eventually be shut out. So here's the new normal. The restoration now opens the door to the exploitation of Cuban labor and resources, and the integration of Cuba into global capitalism. This is a certainty. Whether the Castro regime achieves its goal of adopting the Chinese model of political economy is an open question. But that's basically where I see it, and just summing it up for a couple of seconds here. There is this opening. They've established diplomatic relations, but have relations normalized? And my answer to that is no, they have not. Why? Because the Cuban government and the US government want different things. Okay? The Cuban government wants an arrangement like China has, while the American government prefers not to have that. And that they would like regime change. And they're going to work through their embassy to try to carry that out by working with dissident groups, etc. Whether they'll be successful or not, nobody really knows, but if I was a betting man, I would say no. Okay? Because they've stayed in power for 55 years, not because they're stupid. Okay? They know exactly what the United States is up to. And they're insistent, that's the kind of relationship they want with the United States. The United States can treat them just like they treat China. And you can come in here and you can use our cheap labor, you can invest, and the upper ruling strata of the Communist Party of Cuba, they'll be the ones who will benefit from this. Now, whether or not the Republicans in Congress will lift the embargo, that's another question. I doubt if this is going to happen before the 2016 presidential election. The other thing they promise is they will block the appointment of any U.S. ambassador to Cuba, even though the embassy has been reopened. Okay. So you have elements, and then you have, of course, people running for the Republican Party nomination. Marco Rubio is from Florida. He's from that community. So you just don't know what's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball. But what I tried to do here today was lay out, what's going on. What does normalization mean? Well, it means something different from Cuba than the United States. The United States looks at normalization as going back pre-Castro, whereas Cuba looks at normalization. We're looking forward. The world's now globalized. China's a big player. Look what they've done. We'll take all this investment. They've changed their laws. There's a lot of capitalism going on in Cuba right now already. And what they want to do is maintain their power politically. That is the Communist Party, just like the Communist Party of China. But let me tell you, the U.S. adamantly does not want this. And if the Obama administration doesn't want it, I don't know what a future administration is going to say about it. So stay tuned. This might turn into something more volatile. I'm not saying it's going to, but there are lots of possibilities. But right now, this is where it stands. Normalization. But one thing for sure, if you want to look at this as a historian, as I do, you say, okay, well, how did this happen? Well, and I listed all that in the beginning. That was, basically globalization. You can't. It's very hard to isolate anybody with sanctions or embargoes today, because the global economy is so interconnected. It's very difficult to do that. Okay? And so that failed just on that account. Okay? And in the 1980s, Congress passed the Helms-Burton Act, which was supposed to punish countries that did business with Cuba. Well, these countries that did business with Cuba, they went like this, like Canada. I said, go ahead, punish us. We're going to keep doing business. In fact, we're going to double up our efforts. And so did the Europeans, and now you got the Chinese and you got the Russians. So there's lots of contradictions at play here. And you look at, the future, and you say, well, given what I've just laid out here, like I said before, stay tuned. You just don't know. But this is where I see it right now. Anybody have any questions? Nobody has any comments? You don't have to go over to the foundation now since you got your own food.
Norman, is tourism increasing in Cuba and helping
Yeah, it has been, yeah.
ordinary people, that
Well, no, it's not helping ordinary people.
I've seen on television where little families open restaurants and so on?
Yeah, that's been going on for quite some time, but it's helping the people who are connected high up with the Communist Party more than anything else. Tourism was an answer after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was a huge undertaking. They put a lot of money in that. They put a lot of money in medicine as well. And of course, correspondingly, with the collapse of the USSR and that nationalist model, like say for example in India, they had that nationalist model. And India opened themselves up to global capitalism, and of course all of this investment pours in there. That's just a good example, but my point earlier was, if you connect things globally more and more, it's hard to isolate countries and keep them isolated. I mean, I think we've seen the difficulty of doing that with Putin and Russia. So, and I put up there the multipolar world, the unipolar world. The United States thinks it's still living in a unipolar world, but here, this example of Cuba I've just given you shows you that it's a multipolar world. I mean, how many players are involved in this? You got China, you got Russia, you got the rest of the Latin American countries, and of course you got the United States. Yeah, you go back to the days of Eisenhower when they slapped this embargo on Cuba. Well, that was it. U.S. fiat was law. But no, that's no longer the case. And I think in the process you have to weigh the relative decline of American capitalism. You go back to 1959, 1960, and you compare those days to today, somebody would have to be a fool to say that American capitalism is in a better position than it was then. It's in a worse position than it was then. Here's a country 90 miles from its shore, which they've tried to strangle with an embargo and overthrow it. They weren't successful in doing so. And I don't think, as I said earlier, that they're going to be successful in carrying out regime change even under these conditions.
Norman, you cited help from Russia, from Venezuela, from Brazil, all as contributing to the Cuban economy after 1989.
Mm-hmm.
All three of those countries, though for different reasons, have had some economic downturns
Mm-hmm.
here in just the last couple of years.
Right.
Has that affected Cuba as well, or have they?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me just say this about it. That has pushed Cuba more toward the United States in terms of, rapidly opening things up. And I think, that these negotiations were mediated by the Catholic Church, and they were speeded up because of what you're just talking about. They no longer get, well, they get oil from Venezuela, but how much longer is that going to go on? Russia's economy is in some trouble, and Brazil's economy is in trouble. But they still get help from China. But that's a very good question. I was going to raise that issue, I just didn't have time in this. But yes, that is a factor, and that is something that is pushing them closer to the United States. Yes. But I don't know if that'll be determining in terms of, what kind of government Cuba will end up having or what. All this is sort of up in the air. But that's an excellent question because, yeah, they were able to survive with that assistance from 1989 up until just recently. And they're still getting oil from Venezuela. Russia came in a couple of years ago. Putin was in Cuba, and he just wrote off all the debt that Cuba had with Russia. Wrote the whole thing off. just about the whole thing, I think 90%. And you know, if you look at the Brazilian economy and the Russian economy, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, I would say that Russia's economy, even though it's not as good as it was when oil was higher in price, Russia's economy is in better shape than Brazil's is, and also any other Latin American country. India too, I think, you know. Although Russia's doing business with India and everything. But yeah, Russia's got a lot of reserves. You know. They bought a lot of gold up too, and they have lots of U.S. reserves. I mean, well, it's a big country. It's, you know, biggest landmass country in the world. I don't know how many people live in Russia now, Yuri? What's the population?
Just around 140 million.
140? That's all?
That's the last.
Okay. Well, it was bigger under the USSR, of course.
Well, yeah, it would have been like what, 300.
Yeah.
So yeah, Russia itself is just.
Well, Cuba's about 10 million people. That's a good question. Any other questions? Well, if there aren't, I want to thank you all for coming. And I always do these things and I have fun doing them. I like keeping up with stuff, you know. And I'm a Latin Americanist, so I've always been interested in Cuba. Thank you.
Canada's very good,
What's that?
very good.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Caulfield, for coming and doing this for us. We appreciate it. Just a couple of announcements. The American Democracy Project apologizes for the food being late, first of all. There is a miscommunication. This Wednesday, the 11th of November, we do have a Veterans Day ceremony in the Sheridan Lobby Beach Schmidt. So if you would like to come to that, you're more than welcome to. It's at 10 a.m. And then next week, we do have another Times Talk. It will be by Jacob Turnes, coordinator of student involvement in Greek life, and he will be talking about the roles of fraternities and sororities on today's campuses. So, thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you at our next couple of events. Thanks.
Thanks for coming, Paul.
Well, my pleasure.